Hi, welcome. I'm Paul Carrigan. I'm here with Lisa Pegram and Ravi Shankar to talk about Ravi's new book, The Many Uses of Mint. So new and selected poems 1998 to 2018. And I got a pre-publication copy. That's why
I was going to say, I have the hard copy. I should send this to you.
Oh, it's
Yes.
gorgeous.
Yeah,
It's beautiful. I'd love to have that book on my shelf.
absolutely. I'll send it to both of you.
Well, thank you. Lisa and I are writing a collaborative review of your book, and you've agreed to chat with us as part of our process. So, folks, thank you both for being here. And Ravi, Lisa, and I have prepared some questions. I think we'll just take turns asking them and just kind of see where the conversation goes from there. So, Lisa has the first question.
Okay, so we're talking about place, and I'm really curious about the role of place across this book because it takes us so many different places. I mean, we're in Angkor Wat, we're in Mexico, we're in India, we're in small town USA, we are in an Arab mosque, we're in so many places all over the world. So I wanted to ask about the role of place in the book, but also what brought you to all this travel? How is it that you have been so many places in the world?
It's a great question. I think it's kind of fundamental to who I am, partly because I had a bicultural upbringing. So I was born in D.C. in Howard University Hospital.
Look at that.
My father went to Howard, actually.
Oh, wow.
There was the first wave of Asian immigrants who came because there was a restriction, of course, for many years where they weren't allowed into the U.S. And so he came to do his engineering degree. But when I was in third grade, my grandfather, his father, got ill and worked in a cement factory. And so we uprooted and had to move back to India, where I was there for about 2 years, 18 months, right in the middle of trying to assimilate as an American. And so that experience, I think, is fundamental to my identity. I didn't like it very much when I was a kid, but I got to see, I lived with my cousins and I went to school in India. It was a kind of Catholic convent. And so I think place is fundamental, but not just external place. I'm really interested in internal place as well, which is, I think that the kind of introspective journey that we have is as important as the voyages we take. But I think because of that upbringing, and then I kind of went back and forth from India and the U.S. Up until, when I was in grad school, I moved to New York, and then New York is a place unto itself. It brings the entire cosmos in many ways into the city. And so for me, I think that I always looked at other places, for one, to stretch the kind of provincial and narrow idea of who I could be. I think that I'm kind of considered an Asian American poet, and I like to put pressure on that. I think it is both a good and bad thing in some ways. But then, because I think right around 9/11, that's when I lived in New York. Did you live in New York, Lisa, for a while? No. Oh, okay. Yes, it was right after that along with these two poets, Tina Chang and Natalie Handel, we all lived in New York, and we were totally devastated by what happened, of course. But then in the aftermath, also felt this kind of double wounding by the fact that as people of color, as New Yorkers of color, all of a sudden the orientation towards us changed. It shifted. And so that was when we decided to kind of co-edit this very large anthology, Language for a New Century, which brings together poets, 450 poets from 61 different countries, writing in over 40 different languages. And so for me, that project poetically just expanded my universe, and I think was the start of me really traveling for my work, was doing that anthology.
I
think you're on.
I think I muted your voice to stop the feedback while Ravi was talking, but I can't seem to unmute it now.
Oh, I can unmute myself.
There we go.
Did that
There you
work?
go.
You're back.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Okay.
if we'll each just mute ourselves while we're not talking, that
Okay.
can get rid of a little bit of that squeaking.
That's great.
Did you have more that you wanted to follow up on that, or do you want to go to the next question?
No, you can go ahead and go to the next question. But I did. Well, no, I wanted to add one more thing to that question, because I liked the idea when you were talking about the idea of place being an internal and an external thing. And one thing that I noticed about this manuscript is this constant juxtaposition of the abstract and the concrete. So we do experience all of these things in a very concrete way, but also in their abstraction. That's like in a rhythm of the book. And so I was just curious if that's part of your general lens of the way that you see things, that you have that dichotomy.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that you notice that, because I think that is really crucial to the way that I'm hoping to work, which is a kind of philosophical logic that's conveyed through image. And so for me, the poetic image is really powerful. It has many dimensions. And yet I'm also really interested. I wrote this is years ago, but I had a good friend who was an objectivist. He was really a believer in Robert Creeley and William Carlos Williams, and we had this disagreement. And I wrote this little essay for the Academy of American Poets called In Praise of Abstraction, where I actually defended abstract language as having a role, because, of course, too much of it can subsume the work. And so there needs to be this tension. But I'm always kind of like T.S. Eliot's idea of the objective correlative, that when we describe the world, somehow it's also a porthole into our own psyche and into our own mind, and when it's done well. So I try for that, I think.
I think you succeeded.
Well, Ravi, I'll ask the next question. I'm noticing throughout your whole book a lot of references to various religious traditions, and this may follow from Lisa's observation of places, because different religions have more or fewer adherents in different places. So it might be related to that question. So I think I notice references to Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity specifically, including in this poem on 146, the Shanty of Subliminal Governance. You have a line where you refer to the sacrament of mind looking back at the slack flesh with a wish to be two but not two. And so I'm hearing echoes there with sacrament and two but one, of kind of the Christian sacrament of marriage, and throughout the poems, lots of references like these. And at first, my sense is that these references aren't really about religion. That maybe the religion is the religious language is incidental to talking about something else. But then it happens enough that I started thinking, well, maybe it is. So I wonder if you just might talk about that. Is this just incidental use of religious language like you're using anything else? Or is there hinting to some sort of spiritual sensitivity behind it on your part?
Absolutely. Well, I think that the poets that I most admire, poets like Rilke and Emily Dickinson, always have this dimension where the invisible is made visible in some way. And so I feel like I'm hoping that there's a sensitivity to the miraculous awe and wonder of being alive, which has a spiritual dimension for me. And I was raised in the Hindu religion. I actually think this is an important part of making me a poet, because when I was a young boy, I went to a lot of Hindu rituals and temples. Actually, in Northern Virginia, there's a huge one, the Sri Vishnu temple. But all the liturgy was in Sanskrit, which was a language I didn't understand, and yet somehow it always spoke to me and moved me. And so this idea of a language kind of speaking to your bloodstream in some way, that you're not parsing in a rational way, but that is musically affecting you, was really appealing to me. And so I think that was part of what made me a poet. But I think when I think of other Hart Crane or Gertrude Schnackenberg, I mean, these poets who are interested in the world and what it means to be alive, but not just in a material sense. I think that the purview of art, when it's done well, is that it can provide some insight that transcends the self. And it sounds a little oracular, I guess, because the poems that I feel like that's happening most, hopefully it's not these religious references are not ornamental, but kind of organically coming out of the meditation of the moment of construction and composition and revision, and hopefully can also help put the reader into that space.
Thank you.
Is it my turn? I'm going to ask another question now.
Yes, take it away.
Okay, well, since the sort of last statement you were making sort of talked about this notion of the content and then moving into the craft of things. So you were talking about meter, and I see the presence of so much form across this manuscript. So I wanted to ask you about that, about your relationship with form. And there were just a few things that stood out to me. Really fascinating internal rhyme. I also saw quite a bit of ekphrasis, really beautiful synesthesia, and things like time being perceived as a scent. Or I have here a line, the darkness in New England has a flavor close to anise. So you have all this wonderful, rich, lush imagery, but a very disciplined sense of craft and form. So I'm curious about the dance between the two. And because you do it so well, I think you do then have that reaction that creates that universal experience. It takes it out of the personal and kind of has that, for lack of a better word, that spiritual experience or that greater understanding. That same experience that you had perhaps when you were listening to this liturgy in Sanskrit, and even maybe if the words didn't make sense to you, that there was something else that resonated with you. And I think the content that you're bringing, this vast content you're bringing, matched with what you're doing in terms of craft, is you're really a scientist in terms of that. So I just wanted to talk to you about how you express all of your ideas through craft and form.
It's really a great idea. You called me a scientist, and it's funny because if my parents were here, they would say, "Oh, well, you could have done that instead of becoming a poet," because I was actually really good at math and science when I was growing up, and I think that they hoped that I would follow my father's footsteps and become an engineer, which wasn't going to happen. But I think that kind of that quality of observation and shaping language is kind of mathematic in a way. And for me, form always was fascinated by it because it seems like it's a prison. But when I was I actually went to school at the University of Virginia, and I was really lucky enough to study with Rita Dove and Charles Wright, and Greg Orr was one of my professors, and he spoke about form. He's an American poet who is known for writing. Do you know his work at all, Greg Orr? Oh, okay.
I don't. I certainly know Rita Dove, but I don't know Greg Orr. I'm writing it down right now. Is it with two R's?
Yeah, it's with two R's. And he's a really interesting poet. I mean, I think part of what shaped his poetic sensibility was that as a young teenage boy, I guess he was out hunting and had a hunting accident and ended up killing his brother. And so poetry for him was this place of kind of reflection and redemption. And he used to talk about form providing the scaffold for this really kind of raw, chaotic energy that he couldn't really shape, but then when he had the form. And so what I love about form is that it's generative, that it seems to like it's a prison, but in fact it's pushing you in places and directions you didn't think you would go and opening yourself up to something that's really surprising. So I have, yes, I'm glad you noticed in this book, I have experimented in a lot of forms, but I've also invented a couple of forms. There's this one, a distillation, and I love Terrence Hayes, of course, is a friend and a great hero of mine for his work with form. And so I have a golden shovel in here. And so I love this idea of form being a kind of a way to get at something deeper. But I think when it's working, I've never really had success sitting down and saying, I'm gonna write a sestina. And then I try to write a sestina. It's like putting a cookie cutter on top of the dough. and it usually doesn't turn out that tasty. But when I'm working with something, and then I'm all of a sudden realizing, oh wait, I have this kind of recurrent imagery, and it wants to be repeated, and maybe the Villanelle form would be interesting to. And so it's when I'm in the process of making it that the form kind of speaks to me, that it really works. But yeah, I do like I have like a little homonymics. I mean, I think language is so powerful and so fun, and so it's really like a kid with Play-Doh, really. When you have that feeling of kind of trying to shape language and it's working both formally and emotionally, then I think you're onto something.
Indeed.
Did you have more about that, Lisa? You wanted to follow up on?
I did just want to ask one quick question, a point that came up while you were talking, which is about, you were talking about your parents and the engineering. And I just noticed when you're talking about biology and nature and science, there is so much biology and nature and science in the work, even though it's not a scientific work. So I just find it interesting that you do experience it in a scientific way, even though it's something that's more abstract.
Yeah, I think that's really apt. Doesn't make my parents any happier, but
you do what you can.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about a specific poem that has some science in it. On 77, breastfeeding at the Blue Mosque. So first of all, just wow, such a powerful poem in a lot of ways. The language, the imagery, the blending of science and religion. It seems to me a poem that's sacred and sacrilegious at once. It's beautiful, but it's not pretty. And it strikes me, not to reduce it to this, but at least some of what's going on is kind of a feminist critique of patriarchy in Islam. And so, but as you are not a Muslim woman, I was wondering if you'd just tell me a little bit about working across gender and religious lines in this poem.
Yes. Well, this is where the travel that I've had has been really astonishing. And so I was, this was in 2010, I think. I had an exchange with an academic at Eastern Mediterranean University, which is in Cyprus, and it's in the northern part of Cyprus. I hadn't known too much about Cyprus until I was there, but it's, of course, one of the only places with a militarized zone dividing the country, and the southern part is Greek, and it's part of the EU, and the northern part is considered occupied territory by everyone but Turkey and Pakistan. And somehow this Connecticut school I was at had its sister schools in the northern part of Cyprus. And so when I was there, I brought my whole family, and that was when my youngest daughter was only about 6 months old. And so my older one was about 4, and we moved to northern Cyprus, and there was a lot of challenges. I mean, I think that I'm not with their mother anymore, so this is probably, some of that might have been manifesting itself there, but it was also being in this Muslim country, and I was there at the university, and she was really there alone taking care of the kids, and realizing that there were certain things that you could and could not do, and that in fact things that we take for granted, like speech and worship, were really contested. And so that was kind of the background. But so when we got to travel a little bit and went to Istanbul, and the Blue Mosque there is, of course, extraordinary work of architecture, and it's one of these structures that's really breathtaking. And some of the details in there, in fact, I guess they did have ostrich eggs in the top of there because it apparently was supposed to keep away spiders. And in order to visit, even as a tourist, you had to cover yourself, and you couldn't show your legs. And a woman had to cover her head in order to enter this mosque. And so while we were there, I was thinking about, and you know, our daughter was of the age where she needed to get breastfed, and of course, it was a virtual impossibility to even consider doing it. I mean, even traveling in all of Istanbul, Diane, my ex, would have to find a bathroom or, you know, somewhere where, and then I started thinking about the divine maternal, and how it might be possible that something that is so life affirming and so necessary to all of us being sentient beings could become kind of vulgarized in such a way, and also seem to be an affront to this idea of Islam. And for me, I mean, I think that the discussion about Islam is always pretty reductive. I think we talk about the Sunni and the Shia. We don't really talk about the Sufi strand of Islam, which is really appealing to me. I really was thinking about what it must be like to be a woman, and how something, like I said, that is so fundamental to being human is not allowed expression, and what that means for a people and for a culture. And, it also made me think of my own complicity in, it wasn't like because of this, I didn't go in as a tourist and go to the Blue Mosque. I certainly did. But all of those conflicting thoughts were what I was thinking when I was there.
Thank you.
Well, since we are, did I unmute?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So since you mentioned Cyprus, I'm going to jump to my question about repetition. I'm thinking about the poem, The Cyprus Problem, which I somehow connected in my mind to the Broca's area poem, this kind of notion about what's not versus what is. I mean, expressing what something is by saying what it isn't first. And so I found that super interesting and compelling. And I found a lot of that throughout the text. Also, that's sort of in a thematic way, but also in terms of actual lines. I mean, you have repetition of lines between the poem Heirlooms and then Savagery. This line about the castle looms blue upon the porcelain plate, that line finds itself in two different. And so that's another example. But I did find ideas or actual lines that sort of reappeared in different places throughout the text, which I found that fascinating, that when you place something, it's the same thing, but you place it someplace else and it has it adds to its meaning, or perhaps even deepens its meaning if you're looking at it in totality. So I just want to talk about that because I did find a rhythm of repetition, very intentional repetition. And I felt it was effective because those things did transform in their different places. But how does repetition find itself into your process?
Well, so those are a couple of different cases. Yes, I think that when you repeat something, it can have an almost incantatory effect. It's like when you're casting a spell, and if the magic of that language is working, the more you hear it, the more powerful it becomes. But in the Cyprus problem, that is because it's a canzone, so that form necessitates all of that repetition. And the other ones, like Heirloom that you mentioned, the process for writing that, and I always try to, in each of my books, try to do something a little different. And what in this book, they're not arranged chronologically or by book, but I was able to kind of mix them up thematically. But each of these projects is really different, and so the one that you mentioned with the repetition comes from What Else Could It Be, which was a collaborative writing project. So the part of the reason the repetition is there is the way I worked in that project was I came up with a dozen or so potential starting lines, and I sent them to the poets that I was working with. And I said, if any of these speak to you, kind of build on it and send it back to me, and then we'll kind of discover where it goes by going. And so you could see that. I mean, I collaborated with very different poets, from Eileen Myles to Camille Dungy and in every case, the collaboration was very different. And tellingly, of those dozen lines, probably 5 or 6 were chosen multiple times. Whereas some of the other ones were never chosen at all, which is what kind of it was interesting to me. So that project for me was so fascinating because you're literally working with someone else's aesthetic. And when the poems really, when I look back at some of those poems now and they really seem to work for me, it's when I can't tell what I wrote and what the other person wrote. But there's a third new voice that has emerged that is singing something, and that to me is really exciting because I don't know where that came from.
It's fascinating.
My next question is about the two poems that I love most in the book that appear back to back, and so I associated them as like companion poems. It's on 131 and 132, "Home Together" and "Misty Blue," and they're similar in length and in tone, I think, and in this kind of the domestic situation that's going on between a couple talking and or not talking to each other, having some kind of conflict. And the difference though is that each takes a sharply different direction at the end from each other. So I don't know if I have a specific question about these poems, other than just that maybe you'll talk to us about them, or I don't know, do we have time for you to read one or both? I don't know. I just like these and I wanted to hear some about them.
Yeah, I mean, they're short enough. I guess if you want me to, I could read them both and then talk about them.
That'd be lovely.
Okay. All right. So this first one is called "Home Together." Home together. Between us, the vacuum of early evening, a pot of rice and beans simmering on the stove. Between us, for now, an easy domesticity. The way we move past each other without words, a thin breeze hitched up to bay windows, or footsteps rattling on the hardwood floors. Words are there, though, invisible yet sharp as in scissors pulled from a hand's drooling jaw. Words we could never have meant to speak, but did, recanted, and then spoke again. Such words should have died in our lungs. They've staked between us offensive teeth. And then the other one, it's interesting that you note because they do both verge in a different direction at the end. I think that's right. This one is "Misty Blue." And it is, I'll just say, it's a kind of an American sonnet. So it is 14 lines and it has a rhyme scheme, but it's not completely iambic. Misty Blue. Weird for the afternoons, the boutiques display furniture, fur-coated mannequins, defunct signs from a past time as we stroll along Broadway. Serene until there's a mild censor, the saturnine response, a harsher rebuke, my defensive thrust, and soon we too, nearly grown one, are at war, charged with anger that doesn't turn to lust as it does in the movies. We stop at a parked car, oblivious to the passing faces, and try to rip free from the gravity that holds us, verifying love as an algorithm of hate, something guaranteed to hurt. Drained, return. Then as if from above comes Misty Blue, a version Ella Fitzgerald sings. The music, while it lasts, changes everything. And you're right, they were both poems written around the same time. I think they both tread the same kind of psychic space. But in that second one, Misty Blue, I hope that line is metaphoric for the power of poetry. It is when we're listening to a poem, the music while it lasts changes everything. And so there is a way in which, even in taking something really difficult and transfiguring it and transforming it in the crucible of art into something that might live longer than itself or touch another person, in that way, I think that that personal pain is worth it. But yes, I mean, I think both of those were really about this, trying very hard and earnestly to make this relationship and marriage work, and failing, and feeling like that there must be something nonetheless that I could hold on to and salvage from that. And I think those poems came from that place. You know, it's really very different. When I read them now, they're about almost 20 years old, so it puts me back into a very different space for sure.
A different level of perspective too, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about when I think about this book, the word that comes to my head is juxtaposition. I mean, there are just so many different threads of things that maybe normally, I don't even know if the word normally wouldn't put together, that because they all converge in the same place, create something new and exciting. And we live in a world where people often think that things that are so varied could not possibly exist in one space. And yet they all exist in this one book, but they all exist in you as a vessel of all of these cultures, as a vessel of all these experiences. And so in fact, there is much more harmony to be found than I think people realize. And I think the book does a really beautiful job of doing that within the poems, but also across the manuscript. So because of that, I wanted to ask you about your process of choosing the poems, over all of this work that you had, and how did you choose them? And you kind of hinted at it earlier, but I'm always fascinated also about the order of poems in a book, and the journey that you take the reader on also in the order of the poems, and how you place them next to each other and what happens from beginning to end because of that. So I'm just curious about your process of choosing which poems were going to go in, and how you were going to fit them together in this bigger jigsaw to create whatever end result you wanted to create.
Yes. Well, I was particularly happy because I mentioned, it kind of makes me feel pretty old, but it's new and collected poems. So I was able to kind of look over all the books I published before and putting this together. And I had a version of this book come out in India prior to this. It's called Deepening Groove. And the editor there just wanted me to choose, my 10 best poems from every book, and he put them in chronological order from my first book to my last, which was fine. It was great. But when I was in Australia and this publisher wanted to bring out this work, I asked him, well, can I do something a little different? Because this kind of something similar came out in India. It'd be great to kind of remix it. And he was very open to that idea. And so it got me thinking about, how are these poems written across great expanses of time where I was a different person? How are they related? And are there these kind of themes that they constellate around that I could group them in? And so that's how I went about doing it, I think. I mean, there's some poems that are just way too embarrassing, so I knew there's no way I put them in the book. And then, I felt like that when I was looking at it, I realized that there are these themes of travel and philosophy and eroticism and experimenting with form. And so they kind of naturally group themselves. And I wanted to, when I was in grad school, I studied with Lucy Brock-Broido, who's this poet who had this very mystical idea about putting a book together. And she had mystical ideas about everything. She only felt like you should write 3 months a year in a room with like velvet curtains and candles and kittens. But not for her. but her idea that I still keep to this day was that she felt that there's certain magic in the opening and closing.
Uh-oh.
Ravi, hang on. I was trying to get the mute or the feedback to stop, and I muted you, and I can't unmute you. You got to learn how to use this better. So I think you have to unmute yourself. There.
Am I unmuted now?
Yep. Sorry. Sorry.
It's okay. I don't remember what I was saying, but
you just cut off after you were talking about the person who was saying you should write in a room full of velvet curtains, 3 months out of the year, velvet curtains, cats.
Right.
I mean, kittens. Sorry, kittens. Let's be specific now.
Yeah, I mean, she just recently kind of unexpectedly passed away, and she's a terrific poet. But that idea that the opening and closing, there's some magical power, I retained that. And so in each of these 7 sections, I'm trying to choose poems that are kind of open and close and encapsulate the theme. And then within each section, hopefully that there's some kind of conversation happening in those poems. And I think that I wanted to end. I ended actually intentionally the book with a translation of Andal, so not my own poem, but I felt like that was a way to gesture of the outward opening of what I hoped the book would do. And so Andal is this 8th century Tamil poet saint, extraordinary, who wrote all of this work before the age of about 14 or 15, at which point she apocryphally disappeared. No one knows what happened to her. And she's a great bhakti poet, a poet of kind of divine love. And so I felt like I was, that ending on my translation of her work somehow made it less about me and more about this book in the context of world literature, which spans continents and centuries and is so much larger than myself. And so that was, I think that I made those kind of choices all along the way.
It's interesting because when I was talking to Paul about the manuscript initially, one of the experiences I had of the book was what it was like for me to visit India. The first time I went to India, I felt like it was everything all at once. Everything all at once. The most beautiful thing I had seen, the most horrific thing I'd ever seen, the most inspiring thing I'd ever seen. It was everything all at once. And I found that fascinating because that's what life is, right? It's never suspended on one extreme or the other. It's this flow between all these, for lack of a better word, positive and negative experiences. And so that's what I found so fascinating about India as a place, is that you could just, and I guess everywhere is like that, but for some reason in India, I felt like one second I could be on the verge of tears because a child is asking me for something they don't have, and the next second I'm about to break out laughing because a garbage truck has a beautiful lotus painted on the back of it and plays a little song when it backs up. You know, like all of these things are happening all at one time. And you're forced to deal with them all at one time. And I kind of felt that way about this book, which is why I felt the juxtaposition was so powerful. You just have to, you don't get to compartmentalize. You have to have it. It is digestible, but you have to take it all at one time. So with all of that, then out of all of those poems and all of those themes and all those experiences, why the many uses of mint? Why was that one you decided to make the title work?
So this is where collaboration is a big part of it, because this was my publisher really wanted that to be the title of the book. He kind of liked that poem, and I wanted to name it something different. And so it comes from a poem in the book, but it's not meant to necessarily be indicative, except for the fact that when I think of the many uses of mint, I think of it as a kind of herb, and I think of minting as in minting money and making new. And so all of these different ways in which you can kind of perceive language, I think, is the connection. I love what you said about India, and I think it's full on more than other places, in part because there's 1 billion people there, right? So it is everything. And there's something about Indian culture that exalts the colorful and you see the scatological and the sublime kind of right there in front of you. And yes, in my own work, I never wanted to have to choose. I mean, I know that there are certain poets who have a very spare, pared down vocabulary. But for me, what is so powerful, and I think what I realize now, having 2 cultures to craft my identity from, is that having all of it, you know, not having to choose, but having something that might be more experimental and confessional at the same time, and not having to pledge my allegiance to one aesthetic school or another, that was kind of always important to me in my work in putting this together.
I thought it was brilliant. I loved that about it, actually. That it took you in all of these places, but in a very real and understandable way. You weren't confused by the end of it. It's just that, exactly, it challenges you outside this notion that you have to put it in one box. You really don't.
Well, thank you. I'm glad.
My next question follows up a little bit on that, because that same poem, The Many Uses of Mint, is a good example of what I want to ask about. I noticed some of the poems in the book are very like emotionally effusive, and in contemporary poems written in English, often that's avoided. There's kind of this wry irony as a kind of a predominant tone. And so when I read The Many Uses of Mint, like fresh mint leaves muddled with cane sugar at the bottom of rocks glass full of crushed ice, and an exquisite spiced rum don't taste as good as you, not even close. And then you kind of, that's not even the end of the sentence, you go on. So I was wondering, is this tone ironic, or is it earnestly effusive, or how would you have me read the tone of these poems that are outside of kind of the dominant wry irony in a lot of contemporary writing?
Yeah. Well, I would say that for one thing, I've always been attracted to those places where I'm told I should not go. So things like, I mean, we talked about abstraction before, and that's one of those areas. And I think kind of sincerity and earnestness is a quality that is to be avoided. And so that poem really started out as a kind of love poem, and so it was meant to be kind of directly effusive. But then, as the poem proceeds, the hope is that it then deconstructs that idea, so that it is then not simply just this kind of a sentimental and effusive poem of praise, but then complicates it and kind of on both the molecular level of language, but also in the way sentiment is being expressed, because the relationship itself is much more complicated than that. That I hope to unravel it. But I do, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I think that the trend, and I do know there's this kind of Ashbery school of irony where you can protect yourself by being elliptical. And I think sometimes it can be very effective, and other times it really is covering a lack of true content. And so, I think that it can be a useful tool, but I'm always interested in the actual substance. And so, I mean, sometimes the love poems in here do come from a pretty florid place, and but hopefully they transform as the poem moves. It's interesting also, I should just mention, in the Middle East, in this language for a new century, we found it really hard to find really effective translations of Arabic poetry, in part because the prevailing aesthetic there is really over the top and kind of flowery language, which in Arabic sounds amazing, and in English translation sounds really kind of flowery. And so we had to kind of shift our perspective to accommodate some of that work. And I think all of that is, it's a trend that can change in time.
I wanted to ask about the role of food in your work. I'm a poet, but I'm also a personal chef, and I'm writing a narrative cookbook right now. So I was just in heaven there was so much food and drink, and it's so important. And the power of the table and what happens when at the table and in the exchange of food is so much more than just food. And you address that in so many different beautiful ways. So I wanted to, and a lot. So I wanted to ask you about the presence of food in your work.
Well, I guess I got to come visit you.
Come on down.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that the sensory is a really important part of being alive, and of course, food is part of that. And I'm lucky enough that I was able. My mother's a great South Asian cook, and traveling, of course, part of the way that you access culture is gastronomically through the food. And to me, food is one of these things that becomes a great metaphor for art, because when you eat, you're kind of you're tasting it, and it can be very complicated and can be nuanced and have layers of flavor. But then when you take it inside of you and you digest it, that's when it kind of transforms into something that you could potentially use. Or for me, the art that really moves me is almost like I'm taking it in and I'm making it part of me. And so that idea of food being transubstantiated in the body is like poetry to me, I guess. But yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the first things I notice when I travel to a new country is what do they eat? What kind of cuisine is there? And along with all the architecture and the patois and all of that, the food is really, really important. So
I loved how you talked about switching to using the bitter lemons or the bitter limes in Cyprus. Yeah. Paul?
Well, Lisa, do you have any more questions?
I have one more. I do have one more on my list here, but I can ask it or I can wait. It's up to you.
No, go ahead. Yep.
It's totally in an opposite direction, but I did want to ask about the themes of like colonialism and empire and white supremacy across the book, in poems like Pyramid Starship and Notes Toward Timekeeping, with this what I found to be an amazing line to interrogate the role of the clock in the maintenance of empire. The poem The Spirit Level, Resurrection Song, and looking at it across different kind of colonial experiences. So I'm just curious about that thematically.
Yeah, so I think that for me, I was really able to better understand myself when I studied post-colonial theory. And I was lucky enough to be at Columbia when Edward Said was there. So I sat in on a couple of his lectures. But to me, I mean, so much of the dialogue that we're having and the one that we're not having is really shaped by the legacy of colonialism. And I think I just came back from Australia. And in Australia, anytime you go to a public event, they begin with the what they call Welcome to Nation, which is essentially an acknowledgement of the original stewards of the land, and calling them by the name of their tribe. And a lot of my Australian friends think it's just kind of lip service, and it doesn't really change anything. But I was always profoundly moved because I tried to imagine what America would be like if we acknowledged the Navajo people and the slaves on whose backs the wealth of the nation was built. And I think that because there's not been any kind of acknowledgement or apology, this wound festers and it can't heal. Because until that first kind of basic elementary step is taken, then there's no way to redress all of these wrongs. And so for me, and especially like India is also a very colonial situation. And it's been internalized to such an extent that my aunt, for example, has like skin whitener she would use, My Fair Lady, like bleaching cream. And we were told that, the things that the British liked were kind of better. Even the whole Indian attitude towards eroticism, which if you've gone to some ancient temples is this kind of vast polyphony. And then when the British came, it became very pagan, and the Indians somehow internalized this where eroticism became something totally foreign to them. And so they in fact took some of the most British aspects of colonial life and made it even more British. I mean, if you go to like a cricket club in Bombay, you'll see a kind of old world colonialism that you didn't think existed still. And so I feel like it filters down into so many different ways, and that we need to interrogate it. We need to kind of open up the ways in which it's continuing to affect people of color, women, and the kind of unequal social relations that exist around the world and in our society. And so I think it's really ubiquitous, and I find that I see it everywhere, and so I think that's why it kind of filtered into my work for sure.
I found it very powerful as well because you dealt with all these cultures that have experienced colonialism, and in my experience, these things are also consistent across those cultures. So what you're talking about with like the skin whitener and all these things in India, I mean, skin lightener is the top selling cosmetic in the third world. Everywhere, Latin America, Asia, Africa, is the top selling product. And so this notion of the internalization of colonialism has me kind of in a position of wondering whether post-colonialism ever really happened when you think about the legacy that it left with people. So that's why I found it so powerful in your book, because you talked about so many different cultures. Again, when you have them all juxtaposed against each other and you can see the intersections of those consequences, in something like poetry, I just thought that was another bit of transcendent understanding that you can have when you see it by virtue of that vehicle, so that you can kind of understand the greater picture.
Yeah, and I think that it's part of poetry's job. I mean, I have this kind of Neruda-esque idea that we give voice to the voiceless. And so like when I was in Angkor Wat, which is an amazing temple, but I couldn't help but see, even as I was reveling in the glory of the architecture, the unseen hands of the hundreds of thousands of workers who must have given their lives in the construction of this monument, who will never be known, and yet, you know, the work that they did is here being revered by tourists. And so that kind of tension is always at work, I think, and I think it's important to be sensitive to those perceptions if we're going to kind of be more woke in this moment. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Ravi and Lisa, I have so enjoyed this conversation. It feels like a feast among poets, and I'm grateful to be chatting with you.
Now, can I ask, how do you two know each other?
Yeah. Well, Lisa came to the university that I teach at was it 6, 7 years ago? 5 years? I don't know. And
maybe about 5, yeah. 5,
led
6.
us in an ekphrastic poetry event.
Awesome.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work. I created a sort of, I created an ekphrastic performance poetry workshop. And so the notion of like creating the work and then doing some kind of poetry performance inside of art galleries. And I did it in DC for several of the Smithsonian museums. And then one of the wonderful people that I worked with in DC then moved to where Paul lives. And then she was working with Paul and the students at that school, at the museum she was working in Florida. And then she asked me if I would come down and do the same thing. And then that's how Paul and I met. And I had the pleasure of working with his students and going to sit in his office and talking to him about his work. And we just hit it off and stayed in touch since then.
Awesome. Oh, great.
It was a delight. We're continuing the tradition. In fact, just tomorrow we will shift in my poetry class our attention to putting that event on again.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And how is it that you two connected with each other? Because Paul, you were the one who brought me into this conversation.
I have La Language for New Century. I think that's, Ravi, where I first came across you. Is I used that book in a class, and then we connected on social media, and then something happened at your AWP panel.
Yeah.
You said, who wants to come and join the conversation? And so then I came, and that's where I met you.
Yes, yeah, I was at AWP. In fact, this happening is going to be happening in New York in April, called Matwala, and it's a gathering of South Asian poets. And it's kind of an annual event. There's this amazing Indian-American poet, Usha Kele, who's put it together, but there was an AWP conference about this Matwala, and I think there was a snowstorm, or there was a couple of people who couldn't come, and so Paul graciously said that he would be part of it. It was actually turned out to be, even though it was early in the morning and it didn't have a huge crowd, we kind of circled up and had this very intimate and I thought instructive conversation, particularly about the canon and how to diversify the canon and what we can do in the classroom, and and then Paul and I kind of stayed in contact after that.
That's where the magic happens.
Yeah.
Well, the last thing, my last question, Ravi, for you, is there anything else you'd like to say about the book that we haven't asked you yet?
That's well, no, you know what? I think that Lisa kind of gestured at it. I mean, my question would be whether this kind of juxtaposition, because I've very intentionally in my work always chosen to try something different and not go back to old forms, even when they're effective. And so I guess my question would be whether this kind of polyphony of different styles and voices and themes and kinds of poems can cohabit a space and actually kind of together make something that is greater than what they would be alone. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my overall question and my hope that it does. Yeah.
I certainly experienced it that way. What about you, Paul?
Yeah, I did. I kept finding myself, because it's not organized by book. It's organized in these thematic categories that fit together so well that I kept wondering which poems came from which books. So I guess I should go back and get all of your books to trace them.
There you go. That's how you do that.
But I did find that they fit together really well, and it didn't feel like a chaotic book. It did feel like a book with shape to it.
What was curious to me, though, not from the reader's perspective, because I think exactly what Paul said, the content worked juxtaposed against each other across the books. But as a writer, you, as a person and as a writer, you're at how long of a span of time? You said this was 20 years?
20 years,
over 20 years, these poems. So you developmentally are in a different place as a person and as a writer. So as a reader, you have a bit of distance, but I'm curious as a writer to go back and read something that you wrote 20 years and see how it relates to something that you wrote much more recently. I would find that would be more difficult from the writer's position. So that's why I'm curious about how that was like for you. Something I wrote 20 years ago, I might think, I mean, not that I would throw it away, but just that I wouldn't know necessarily how to weave it as seamlessly as you've woven all of these poems together.
Well, that's why some of it I just left, and I'm hoping that it'll never come back to the light of day. I should give a shout out to the press, Recent Works Press, which is an Australian press, but they're doing this terrific work. They just did an anthology of Japanese women poetry, and so I think all these small presses are so great, but to go all the way to Australia and then find this press that was willing to kind of take it on, and of course now you can buy the books on Amazon and you can sell them anywhere. So, but I have to give them a shout out. It's always nice when an editor believes in your vision for it, and he allowed me to kind of do the non-traditional thing in putting the book together, which I was grateful for.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's been great to talk to both of you.
Yes.
Indeed, it has been. It's so nice meeting you, Ravi.
Absolutely. Yes, we'll stay in contact. Well, for one thing, I will email you and get your addresses, so I'll make sure I can give you a copy of the book. So
I would love to do an exchange. If you send me your address, I'll send you my chapbook too.
Perfect. That sounds perfect. I'd love that.
Yeah.
Well, folks, thanks so much, and so long.
It's so long.
It's so long. Well,
farewell.
Let me know what happens with the review, and if you need anything else, don't hesitate to get in touch, guys.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. See you.
Thank you for your beautiful work. It was really a joy to read.
Oh, that means so much. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah. All right. See you, Paul.
What an accomplishment.
All right.
Bye.